Could one man's fury have prevented the bloodiest stalemate of the 20th century? As the guns of World War II fell silent, General George Patton saw a new, more terrifying shadow rising from the east. While Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley sought a fragile peace, Patton demanded a final crusade against Joseph Stalin's Red Army, predicting with chilling accuracy that the next great war would ignite not in Europe, but on the distant, rugged hills of Korea. The smoke had barely cleared from the ruins of Berlin when General George S. Patton Jr. realized that the world had not found peace, but had merely exchanged one tyrant for another. Standing amidst the wreckage of a continent he had helped liberate, the commander of the Third Army did not feel the triumph of a conqueror, but rather the heavy, suffocating weight of a prophet ignored. While the American public celebrated the return of their sons and the collapse of the Thousand-Year Reich, Patton stared across the Elbe River with a growing sense of existential dread, watching the disciplined but weary columns of the Soviet Red Army as they consolidated their grip on Eastern Europe. He did not see them as allies who had shared the burden of defeating Hitler, but as a predatory force that understood only the language of absolute violence and territorial expansion. Patton's strategic mind, honed by decades of historical study and the visceral experience of armored warfare, immediately began to dissect the geopolitical reality of 1945 with a brutal clarity that terrified his superiors in Washington. He argued passionately that the United States had stopped too soon, leaving the job half-finished and allowing a massive ideological vacuum to be filled by a regime that he believed was fundamentally incompatible with Western democracy. In his private diaries and increasingly indiscreet public statements, Patton characterized the Soviet Union as a primitive, yet unstoppable juggernaut, a force that would inevitably push into Asia and the Pacific once it had digested the spoils of Europe. His analysis was not merely born of a reflexive anti-communism, but of a deep understanding of Russian history and the strategic imperatives that drove the Kremlin to seek warm water ports and buffer states across the globe. Just like that, the hero of the Battle of the Bulge transformed into a political liability, a man whose warrior spirit could not be deactivated by a simple ceasefire order. Patton observed the Soviet military machine with the eye of a predator evaluating its next meal, noting the massive numerical superiority of their infantry and the rugged reliability of their T-34 tanks, which he considered superior to the American Shermans in everything but crew comfort. He recognized that the Soviet Union was a land power of unprecedented scale, and he feared that the rapid demobilization of American forces would leave the world defenseless against a sudden surge toward the English Channel or a deep penetration into the Korean Peninsula. To Patton, the geopolitical landscape of East Asia was a ticking time bomb, a secondary front that would soon become the primary theater of a new global struggle between two irreconcilable worldviews. Suddenly, the tension between Patton and the Supreme Allied Command reached a breaking point as he openly advocated for rearming captured German soldiers to assist in a preemptive strike against the Soviets. He viewed the potential conflict as an inevitability and believed that striking while the United States held the monopoly on the atomic bomb and a fully mobilized industrial base was the only logical course of action. His foresight regarding Korea was particularly startling, as he understood that the Soviet entry into the war against Japan in August of 1945 was not a gesture of assistance, but a calculated land grab designed to secure a foothold on the Asian mainland. He watched the division of the Korean Peninsula at the 38th parallel with profound skepticism, knowing that such arbitrary lines on a map were nothing more than invitations for future aggression. Immediately, the narrative shifts to the psychological landscape of a leader who felt the tides of history shifting beneath his feet while his hands were tied by the bureaucracy of peace. Patton's ego, often criticized as his greatest weakness, was in this moment his greatest strength, allowing him to see past the diplomatic niceties of the Potsdam Conference and recognize the cold, hard reality of power politics. He saw Stalin not as a partner in a new world order, but as a successor to Genghis Khan, a ruler who would exploit any sign of weakness or hesitation to expand his empire from the Sea of Japan to the Atlantic Ocean. This assessment of Soviet intentions was the foundation of his tactical blueprints, which prioritized extreme mobility, overwhelming firepower, and a relentless offensive spirit that he believed was the only way to counter the Soviet doctrine of massed artillery and human wave attacks. But the American leadership, led by Eisenhower and the political establishment in Washington, was exhausted by years of total war and desperate to return to a state of normalcy. They viewed Patton's warnings as the ramblings of a man who had stayed at the front for too long, a soldier who knew how to kill but did not know how to live in peace. They failed to realize that Patton's tactical genius was inseparable from his strategic intuition. He understood that the nature of warfare was changing, that the next conflict would not be a slow, methodical struggle for territory, but a high-stakes game of maneuver where the first few weeks would determine the outcome for decades. He envisioned a defense of South Korea that relied not on static lines, but on the rapid deployment of armored divisions that could exploit the mountainous terrain to trap and destroy invading forces before they could establish a solid front. Just like that, Patton's blueprints for a hypothetical Korean conflict began to take shape in his mind, centered on the concept of active defense through aggressive counterattacks. He believed that the Soviet-backed North Korean forces would utilize the same tactics of infiltration and encirclement that the Red Army had mastered on the Eastern Front. And he argued that the only way to defeat such an enemy was to outpace them in decision-making and execution. He emphasized the importance of air superiority and the integration of tactical air support with ground maneuvers, a lesson he had perfected during the race across France in 1944. Patton knew that in the narrow corridors of the Korean peninsula, the commander who controlled the heights and the roads with mobile fire brigades would hold the keys to victory. Suddenly, we see the contrast between Patton's vision and the reality that would eventually unfold in 1950. While Patton advocated for a robust, permanent military presence in Asia to deter Soviet encroachment, the United States proceeded with a massive reduction in its conventional forces, leaving only a skeletal garrison in South Korea. This decision, which Patton would have viewed as a catastrophic strategic error, created the very vacuum that Stalin and Kim Il-sung eventually exploited. Patton's tactical blueprint for Korea would have looked very different from the desperate holding action at the Pusan perimeter. He would have pushed for a preemptive buildup of logistical hubs and the training of South Korean forces in the art of combined arms warfare, ensuring that any invasion from the north would be met not by a retreating rabble, but by a wall of disciplined, mobile steel. Immediately, the weight of history settles on the missed opportunities of 1945. Patton's insistence on understanding the Russian soul led him to conclude that the Soviets would only respect a force that was prepared to use ultimate violence. He studied the topography of East Asia with the same intensity he had applied to the hedgerows of Normandy, recognizing that the mountains of Korea would be a nightmare for traditional infantry, but a proving ground for specialized mountain armor units. He envisioned a conflict where American technical superiority in communications and logistics would negate the Soviet advantage in manpower, provided the political will existed to engage in a decisive, short-duration war rather than a prolonged war of attrition. But Patton's voice was silenced by a mysterious car accident in December of 1945, an event that some conspiracy theorists still link to his outspoken views on the Soviet threat. Regardless of the cause of his death, the loss of his strategic mind left a void in the American military establishment, just as the Cold War began to freeze the world in a state of permanent tension. Without Patton's aggressive advocacy, the United States drifted into a policy of containment that was inherently reactive rather than proactive. The crucial decision point that Patton had identified, the moment when the West could have dictated the terms of the post-war world, had passed, and the price would be paid in the blood of thousands on the Korean Peninsula just 5 years later. Just like that, the narrative focuses on the specific tactical execution Patton would have favored in a Korean scenario. He was a master of the indirect approach, always seeking to strike the enemy where they were weakest rather than where they were strongest. In Korea, this would have meant bypasses, deep penetrations into the rear echelons of the North Korean People's Army, and the use of amphibious landings long before Douglas MacArthur ever conceived of the Incheon operation. Patton believed that the key to defeating a communist insurgency or a conventional invasion was to decapitate the leadership and disrupt the supply lines with such speed that the enemy would fall into a state of tactical paralysis. He wanted to fight a war of movement in a land that many thought was only suited for the slow grind of the bayonet. Suddenly, we examine the psychological aspect of Patton's leadership during this period of forced peace. He was a man possessed by the ghosts of past warriors, believing himself to be a reincarnation of soldiers from throughout history. This gave him a unique perspective on the cyclical nature of conflict, allowing him to see the Korean War not as a new phenomenon, but as a continuation of the eternal struggle between the steppe and the city, between autocracy and liberty. His despair at the political situation was not born of a desire for personal glory, but of a genuine fear that the sacrifices of World War II were being squandered by leaders who lacked the stomach for the hard choices that lay ahead. He felt the cold breath of the future on his neck, and it smelled of cordite and frozen earth. Immediately, the narrative draws a line from Patton's Third Army to the Eighth Army that would struggle in Korea. Patton's emphasis on blood and guts was often misunderstood as a disregard for human life. But in reality, it was a philosophy designed to save lives by ending the war as quickly as possible. He believed that a hesitant commander was a murderous commander, and he would have viewed the cautious, incremental approach taken by the United Nations forces in the early days of the Korean War as a recipe for disaster. His tactical blueprints demanded that commanders be at the front, feeling the pulse of the battle, and making split-second decisions that could turn a retreat into a rout of the enemy. But as the winter of 1945 deepened, Patton found himself increasingly isolated, his commands stripped away, and his reputation tarnished by his inability to hold his tongue. He was a relic of a total war, living in a world of police actions and diplomatic spheres of influence, concepts he found both baffling and cowardly. Yet his analysis of the geopolitical landscape of East Asia remained unshakable. He saw the looming shadow of Mao Zedong's forces in China and the inevitable alliance between Moscow and Beijing, predicting that a failure to secure Korea would lead to a domino effect that would threaten the entire Pacific Rim. Patton was the Cassandra of the Cold War, a man whose warnings were as accurate as they were unwelcome. The silence of the grave did not end the argument that George Patton started in the ruins of Bavaria. By 1946, the Iron Curtain that Patton had predicted was falling across Europe with a heavy, metallic finality, and the strategic vacuum in East Asia began to suck the world toward a second global cataclysm. While the American public focused on the burgeoning post-war economic boom, the remnants of Patton's Third Army watched in frustration as their hard-won technical edge eroded through neglect and rapid demobilization. Just like that, the geopolitical map of the world began to bleed red, exactly as Patton had feared during those tense meetings in occupied Germany. In Washington, the architects of the New World Order relied on the policy of containment, a reactive strategy that sought to block Soviet expansion wherever it appeared. But Patton would have viewed this as a fatal surrender of the initiative. He believed that the only way to prevent a fire was to strike the matchbearer before the flame was lit. As Mao Zedong's communist forces gained momentum in China, the strategic importance of the Korean Peninsula transformed from a backwater colonial outpost into the ultimate front line of the Cold War. Suddenly, the ghost of Patton seemed to haunt the corridors of the Pentagon when news broke on June 25, 1950, that North Korean forces had shattered the peace of the 38th parallel. The invading army did not use primitive tactics. They utilized a Soviet-style blitzkrieg spearheaded by the very T-34 tanks that Patton had analyzed 5 years earlier. The North Korean People's Army moved with a speed and coordination that stunned the unprepared American and South Korean defenders, driving them ruthlessly toward the southern tip of the peninsula. Immediately, the tactical blueprints Patton had envisioned during the winter of 1945 became the missing manual for a desperate defense. Patton's primary tactical contribution to a Korean scenario would have been the absolute rejection of the retreating mindset. He often said that an army that stops to dig a hole is an army that has already lost its soul. In the opening weeks of the Korean War, American units were plagued by tank panic and a lack of aggressive leadership at the small unit level. Had Patton been in command of the 8th Army, he would have met the North Korean armor not with static anti-tank positions, but with concentrated mobile fire brigades that utilized the terrain to flank the invading columns. He would have turned the narrow mountain passes into killing zones where American technical superiority in radio communication and coordinated artillery could negate the numerical advantage of the enemy. But the reality on the ground in 1950 was a far cry from the disciplined juggernaut Patton had led across the Rhine. The American soldiers sent to Korea were often undertrained, poorly equipped, and led by officers who had forgotten the brutal lessons of 1944. Patton's obsession with physical fitness and the look of a soldier was not just vanity. It was a psychological weapon designed to maintain discipline under the most extreme pressures. In the freezing mud of the Pusan perimeter, the lack of that Patton-esque discipline resulted in unnecessary casualties and a breakdown in unit cohesion that almost led to a total American evacuation of the peninsula. Immediately, the narrative shifts to the dramatic arrival of Douglas MacArthur's Incheon landing, a masterstroke of maneuver that Patton certainly would have admired for its audacity, if not its complexity. However, Patton's tactical blueprint would have likely diverged from MacArthur's after the successful breakout from Pusan. While MacArthur looked for the grand gesture, Patton would have focused on the relentless pursuit. He believed that once an enemy is shattered, you must never give them a moment to breathe, to reorganize, or to dig in. Patton's Third Army style of pursuit would have seen American armored columns racing toward the Yalu River with such velocity that the logistical tail of the Chinese volunteer army would have been severed before they could even cross the border. Just like that, the war entered its most dangerous phase as hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers poured across the frozen Yalu River in November of 1950. This was the moment Patton had truly anticipated, the clash between Western technology and the sheer mass of Eastern manpower. Patton's analysis of the Russian soul extended to his understanding of all communist military doctrines, which he believed relied on the cheapness of human life. He would have countered the Chinese human wave attacks with a doctrine he called the meat grinder, the concentrated use of proximity-fused artillery and tactical air support to create a wall of fire that no amount of manpower could penetrate. Suddenly, the conflict in Korea transformed into a war of logistics and endurance, where the freezing temperatures became as deadly as the enemy fire. Patton, a veteran of the horrific winter during the Battle of the Bulge, knew that a soldier's morale is tied directly to his stomach and his feet. He would have been outraged by the failure of the American supply chain to provide adequate winter gear for the troops at the chosen reservoir. His blueprint for such a conflict involved the Red Ball Express on steroids, a relentless logistical machine that prioritized ammunition and warm clothing over all else, ensuring that the fighting edge of the infantry remained sharp even in sub-zero temperatures. But the most significant divergence between Patton's hypothetical leadership and the actual conduct of the war lay in the relationship between the military and the political establishment. Patton's ego and despair would have reached a boiling point during the Truman-MacArthur controversy. Patton, like MacArthur, believed that in war there is no substitute for victory. But unlike MacArthur, Patton's brilliance was in the execution of the theater-level battle, not in political posturing. However, the constraints of a limited war would have been anathema to Patton. He would have viewed the refusal to bomb Chinese supply depots across the Yalu as a betrayal of the men on the front lines, likely resulting in a public explosion that would have ended his career even more spectacularly than his slapping incident in Sicily. Immediately, we must analyze the role of armor in the rugged Korean terrain, a subject Patton would have mastered through sheer force of will. While many commanders thought Korea was not tank country, Patton would have proven them wrong, just as he had in the hedgerows of Normandy. He would have utilized the M26 Pershing and M46 Patton tanks as mobile pillboxes and psychological anchors for the infantry. He understood that a tank is not just a gun on tracks. It is a symbol of invincibility that can break the spirit of an enemy infantryman. His tactical execution would have involved armored cavalry sweeps through the valleys, flushing the enemy out of the heights and into the open, where they could be destroyed by air power. Just like that, the war slowed to a bloody stalemate along the Kansas-Wyoming line in 1951, a return to the trench warfare of World War I that Patton loathed with every fiber of his being. To Patton, the stalemate was the ultimate failure of military leadership. He would have viewed the peace talks at Panmunjom as a theater of the absurd, a way for the enemy to regroup while American soldiers died for hills with numbers. His tactical blueprints would have demanded a breakthrough, a massive concentrated blow at a single point in the line to restore mobility to the front. He would have traded space for time, lured the Chinese into a trap, and then slammed the door shut with an armored envelopment that would have made the Falaise Gap look like a minor skirmish. Suddenly, we see the true consequence of the world ignoring Patton's 1945 warnings. The Korean War ended not with a victory, but with an armistice, a temporary pause in a conflict that remains unresolved to this day. Patton's prescient analysis of Soviet intentions was validated by the decades of Cold War tension that followed, a period of history defined by the very proxy wars that he had hoped to prevent by a decisive showdown in 1945. The geopolitical landscape of East Asia remained fractured, with the 38th parallel serving as a permanent scar on the earth. a monument to the indecision that Patton had so fiercely campaigned against. Immediately, the psychological aspect of the war's conclusion comes into focus. The soldiers who returned from Korea did not receive the parades that Patton's Third Army enjoyed. They were the veterans of a forgotten war, a conflict that didn't fit the neat narrative of good versus evil that World War II provided. Patton's fear of a soft America, one that lacked the stomach for the long, grinding struggle against communism, seemed to be coming true. He had warned that if the United States did not finish the job in Europe, they would be fighting the same enemy in every corner of the globe for generations. Korea was the first installment of that heavy price. But what if Patton had lived? What if he had been the one to command the United Nations forces in 1950? The history of the 20th century might have looked very different. We might have seen a unified democratic Korea and a Soviet Union forced into a defensive crouch decades before its eventual collapse. Patton's tactical blueprints were not just about maps and tanks. They were about the application of absolute unyielding will to the problem of human aggression. He was a man who understood that the only way to avoid a long war is to be willing to fight a short, brutal one. Just like that, the legacy of George Patton remains intertwined with the frozen hills of Korea and the long shadows of the Cold War. His vision of a world where the West stood firm against the tide of totalitarianism was a vision born of blood and iron. While his methods were often controversial and his personality abrasive, his strategic intuition was rarely wrong. He saw the fire coming when others only saw the smoke, and he offered a way to extinguish it before it consumed the world. The warrior prophet of the Third Army was silenced, but his warnings continue to echo through the history of every conflict where the price of indecision is paid in the lives of the young. Immediately, we realize that the story of George Patton and the Korean War is not just a story of what if, but a lesson in the importance of listening to those who see the world as it is, rather than as they wish it to be. The geopolitical landscape of East Asia today is still shaped by the decisions made and not made between 1945 and 1953. And Patton's tactical blueprints for a Korean conflict remain a testament to a man who lived and breathed the art of war, a commander who knew that the greatest tragedy is not the fighting of a war, but the failure to win it when the opportunity arises. If General Patton had been in command during the initial North Korean invasion, do you believe his aggressive Third Army tactics would have ended the war in months? Or would his push to the Yalu have triggered a nuclear World War III even sooner? Let me know your strategic choice in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.